I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 25. Let's focus on verse 39. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise the Lord, who championed my cause against Nabal's insults and restrained his servant from doing evil. The Lord brought Nabal's evil deeds back on his own head." And then David sent messengers to speak to Abigail about marrying him. Nabal was rough and he was nasty. My Bible translation defines his name as boorish. We know that he was wealthy because he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. Nabal's men were busy holding a profitable and somewhat festive sheep shearing time in Carmel. And after all that David had done to protect Nabal's investments, Nabal's response to David's desperate request was completely disrespectful. Of course, Nabal had never asked for David's assistance, but it was only right to expect that a wealthy man like Nabal would show generous appreciation for services rendered. But Nabal didn't just say no, he called David a no account, and he says that David is a runaway slave. And David's men were just a bunch of nobodies who had no right to my bread, to my water, or to my meat. Such an ungrateful and selfish man deserved to be taught a lesson, but did he really deserve to die by David's sword? Well, enter his wife, Abigail. Abigail acted out of self-preservation, but also with equal parts prophetess and national advisor. Abigail intervened on behalf of her family, on behalf of her king, and on behalf of her nation. The theme of today's chapter is restraint. And so there's no question, Abigail's plea to David was directed by the Lord to restrain David. Otherwise, David may have foolishly jeopardized God's plan for David, for Israel, and ultimately for the line of the Messiah. So today's chapter teaches us how the Lord rescues his servants from their own stupidity. Anybody else want to raise their hand? I'm raising mine. He's rescued me from my stupidity. How God often intervenes to restrain us from executing sinful plans, even when we don't see the sin in them. God will graciously, albeit firmly, intercept us on the road to foolishness. So not only does God do this for an anointed king, his mercy extends to all of his servants. So we can all testify of how the Lord has constructed roadblocks on our journeys to self-destruction. In mercy, God frustrates our plans, and his kindness hinders our paths. It's important that we respond rightly to such instances of the Lord's restraining. If you carefully read chapters 24 and 25 back to back, you'll notice the constraint in David's attitude. Between his attitudes towards Saul and Nabal, David compartmentalizes his faith, and in that we see a problem for the future. In chapter 24, David is the restrainer. He refuses to harm Saul or to permit his soldiers to do so. And in chapter 25, David has to be himself restrained. He wants to kill Nabal and all of Nabal's men over an insult. David responded in faith to Saul, and yet because he didn't consult the Lord, David responded in the flesh regarding Nabal. And had the Lord not come in and stopped his actions, David would have got himself in a pickle that he couldn't unpickle. This is a shadow of things to come. There's a Hittite named Uriah who would have done well to have paid attention to this account. David was the kind of guy who would refuse to take personal vengeance on the Lord's anointed, but he was willing to liquidate a private Israelite. And one of his best friends, Uriah, who was among David's mighty men. I remember times when I have seen God's way clearly in some dilemma that I was in, but I missed the Lord completely in some other situation where the very same principles applied. We must never cease seeking the Lord and relying on his leading. Proverbs 16 verse 9, "For in his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps." Let's keep seeking the Lord day by day and chapter by chapter in the Bible together. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Groundworks Ministries operates entirely through financial donations from faithful people like you. And if you're being ministered to through the Bible teaching of Groundworks Ministries, and you'd like to help us to grow, to help reach other people in our generation with the gospel, well then would you consider donating to Groundworks Ministries today? We can only do as much with the resources that we have, and there's so much more to do. Donating is secure and it's easy at our website. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.